In October of 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in human history. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of catastrophe, each armed with weapons capable of destroying civilization itself. Cities across America went about their daily routines unaware that a series of decisions being made behind closed doors in Washington and Moscow could determine whether the planet would survive the month. It began with a photograph taken from the sky, an image that revealed something the United States had feared for years but hoped would never happen. High above the island of Cuba, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew silently across the Caribbean. The pilot's mission seemed routine at first. Since the Cuban Revolution had brought Fidel Castro to power, the United States had watched the island carefully. Only 90 miles from Florida, Cuba had become a strategic concern, especially after its government began forming closer ties with the Soviet Union. The Cold War was already a dangerous game of power and influence, and both superpowers understood that geography could change everything. When the U-2 photographs were analyzed days later in Washington, intelligence officers immediately realized something was terribly wrong. Hidden among the fields and forests of Cuba were construction sites that matched the unmistakable layout of Soviet nuclear missile installations. Launch pads, fuel storage, missile shelters, equipment designed to house medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking American cities within minutes. For years, the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union had depended on distance. Soviet missiles could not easily reach American territory, while American nuclear weapons were positioned much closer to Soviet borders. Now that balance was about to change overnight. If the installations in Cuba became operational, cities like Washington, New York, and Chicago could be destroyed in a matter of minutes. The photographs were delivered directly to President John F. Kennedy. When he examined the evidence, the implications were immediately clear. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles within striking distance of the United States. It was not simply a military development. It was a strategic shock that could alter the entire Cold War. Kennedy assembled a small group of advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Inside the White House, behind closed doors and under extreme secrecy, these men debated what to do next. The options before them were all dangerous. Some military leaders urged immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Others warned that bombing Cuba would almost certainly provoke a Soviet response somewhere else in the world, possibly in Europe. There was another option: invasion. American forces could land in Cuba, overthrow Castro's government, and remove the missiles directly. But invasion carried enormous risks. Soviet troops were already stationed on the island, and intelligence estimates suggested that thousands of them were guarding the installations. A full-scale invasion could ignite a war between the two superpowers. Kennedy understood the stakes. A miscalculation could lead not just to conventional war, but to nuclear exchange. Millions of lives could vanish within hours. The president faced one of the most difficult decisions any leader had ever encountered. Rather than strike immediately, he chose a different approach. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the American public on national television. His voice was calm, but the message was alarming. The United States had discovered nuclear missile bases under construction in Cuba. To prevent further escalation, the United States would impose what it called a quarantine around the island. In practical terms, it meant a naval blockade. American warships would intercept Soviet vessels attempting to deliver additional military equipment to Cuba. The announcement stunned the world. Suddenly, the Cold War was no longer a distant geopolitical rivalry. It had become an immediate crisis with potentially catastrophic consequences. Across the United States, people rushed to grocery stores, stocked up on supplies, and listened anxiously to radio broadcasts. Schools practiced emergency drills. Families discussed fallout shelters. For the first time, nuclear war felt terrifyingly real. The ATC, American naval forces, moved into position. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines formed a barrier across the Caribbean. Soviet cargo ships carrying military supplies were already on their way to Cuba. If they continued forward, they would meet American warships blocking their path. The confrontation could escalate in seconds. For several days, the world waited. Then came the moment that nearly changed everything. American radar operators reported that Soviet ships were approaching the blockade line. Orders had already been issued. If necessary, U.S. naval forces would stop the vessels. The situation was tense beyond description. A single misinterpreted action, an aggressive maneuver, a warning shot, a misunderstanding, could trigger a chain reaction leading to war. As the ships approached the line, something unexpected happened. Several Soviet vessels slowed down. Then they turned around. But the crisis was far from over. While the blockade prevented additional weapons from reaching Cuba, the missiles already on the island were still being prepared for launch. Meanwhile, tensions between Washington and Moscow intensified. Communications between the two governments became urgent and complicated. Messages crossed the Atlantic carrying proposals, warnings, and threats at the same time. American U-2 aircraft continued flying reconnaissance missions over Cuba to monitor the missile sites. These flights were extremely dangerous. Soviet air defense systems on the island were capable of shooting down high-altitude aircraft. Yet the United States needed constant intelligence to determine whether the missiles were becoming operational. On October 27th, the crisis reached its most dangerous point. An American U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed instantly. Inside the White House, the news sent shockwaves through Kennedy's advisors. Many believed it was now time for military retaliation. Bombing the missile sites could begin within hours. Yet Kennedy hesitated. He believed that if the United States attacked, the Soviet Union might respond somewhere else, perhaps in Berlin, where American and Soviet forces already faced each other across a divided city. The conflict could spiral rapidly into nuclear war. Behind the scenes, secret communications between Washington and Moscow intensified. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent messages proposing possible solutions. One suggested that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. Another message demanded something more controversial: the removal of American nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey. For a moment, it seemed impossible to reconcile the demands. Then diplomacy, quiet, careful, and deliberate, began to work. The United States publicly agreed not to invade Cuba. Privately, through secret negotiations, it also agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. The arrangement allowed both sides to claim victory without humiliation. On October 28, 1962, the crisis finally ended. The Soviet Union announced that it would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba and return the weapons to Soviet territory. American reconnaissance flights soon confirmed that the launch sites were being dismantled. The world had stepped back from the edge. Historians would later call the Cuban Missile Crisis the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. In those 13 days, the survival of modern civilization depended on decisions made under extraordinary pressure. Nuclear weapons capable of killing tens of millions were only minutes away from launch. What makes the crisis even more unsettling is how close disaster truly was. Unknown to American intelligence at the time, Soviet forces in Cuba already possessed tactical nuclear weapons. If the United States had invaded the island, Soviet commanders had authority to use them against American troops. The result could have triggered a full-scale nuclear exchange between the superpowers. The lessons of October 1962 reshaped global politics. In the months that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union established a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, the famous hotline. The goal was simple: ensure that leaders could speak directly during future crises, reducing the risk of misunderstanding. The Cuban Missile Crisis also changed how the world thought about nuclear weapons. It revealed how fragile the balance of power truly was and how easily a chain of events could escalate beyond control. For 13 days, humanity held its breath, and in the end, the survival of the world depended not on weapons, but on restraint. Two leaders, facing unimaginable pressure, chose negotiation instead of annihilation. History would remember that decision as the moment when the Cold War came closest to destroying the planet, and the moment when it narrowly stepped back from the brink.